Welcome to this long and quiet journey through the strange and fascinating world of medieval medicine. If you're listening to this while preparing to sleep, know that you're in for a gentle exploration of how people in the Middle Ages tried to understand the human body, disease, and healing. This is not a tale of modern science or clear facts. It's a slow unfolding of forgotten practices, ancient beliefs, and the long road from superstition to science. For most of the medieval period, medicine was not based on experimentation or anatomy as we understand it today. Instead, it was built on texts, writings from antiquity that were copied and recopied, interpreted through layers of religion, philosophy, and guesswork. Doctors weren't necessarily surgeons, and surgeons weren't always seen as respectable. Much of what passed for healing involved herbs, charms, prayers, and balancing invisible forces within the body. To begin, let us travel to early medieval Europe, sometime around the 6th or 7th century. The Western Roman Empire has collapsed, and with it, much of the infrastructure that supported classical learning. Libraries are gone, schools are scarce. The knowledge of the ancient world is now preserved mainly in monasteries, remote, quiet places where monks copy texts by hand. It is here, in candlelit scriptoria, that the seeds of medieval medicine are planted. At the heart of medieval medical thought is the ancient theory of the four humors. It comes from Galen, a Greek physician whose ideas shaped European medicine for over 1,000 years. According to Galen, the body contains four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health is a matter of keeping these in balance. If a person is sick, it means one humor is too strong or too weak. Treatment, then, is about restoring that balance. This might involve bloodletting, inducing vomiting, or prescribing a certain diet. This idea of humoral balance explains much about medieval medical logic. Why would a physician recommend leeches? Because too much blood, especially in spring, when blood was thought to dominate, could lead to fever or even madness. Why were people given laxatives or made to sweat? These were ways to purge excess humors. It sounds strange now, but it made perfect sense in a world where illness was not about germs, but about imbalance. Medicine in the early Middle Ages was also deeply religious. Sickness was often seen as a spiritual problem. Perhaps it was punishment for sin or a test of faith. Healing, then, required more than herbs. It required prayer. Saints were believed to have healing powers. Pilgrims traveled long distances to touch relics or visit holy wells. Some saints were known specifically for curing certain ailments. Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Blaise for throat infections. In monasteries, monks acted as caretakers for the sick. They cultivated herb gardens and preserved medical texts, often translating them from Greek or Arabic into Latin. The Benedictine rule, the guidebook for monastic life, encouraged the care of the ill as a form of devotion. Monks prepared remedies from herbs such as sage, rosemary, and hyssop. They also recorded what worked and what didn't, gradually building a body of practical knowledge. Though it was still entangled with religious belief, women also played an important role in early medieval healing. Most healing happened in the home, and women, especially older women, were the ones preparing poultices, salves, and teas. These wise women were trusted by their communities, even though their knowledge was not written down. Over time, however, their authority would be questioned, especially during periods of religious reform or panic about witchcraft. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, medical knowledge was thriving. While Europe was still in recovery after the fall of Rome, Scholars in cities like Baghdad and Cordoba were translating Greek medical texts and expanding upon them. Figures like Avicenna and Al-Razi wrote encyclopedic works that would later reach Europe through Latin translation. These texts introduced new ideas, new treatments, and more precise diagnoses. But that part of the story will come a little later. For now, in this early phase of medieval medicine, we find a world where illness is mysterious and often frightening. There are few hospitals. Most people are treated at home or in monasteries. Medical care is as much about ritual as it is about remedy. Healing is slow, uncertain, and sometimes more spiritual than physical. This is the starting point of our journey. In the next section, we'll explore how medieval medicine began to evolve through contact with the Islamic world, the rise of medical schools, and the slow reawakening of anatomical study. But for now, rest your mind and imagine a world where the body was governed by humors, the stars influenced your health, and a humble monk with a few herbs and a worn book might be your only hope in times of sickness. To understand medieval medicine, we must first look at what survived from the ancient world. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, much of the classical knowledge in science and medicine was lost, or perhaps more accurately, scattered. But it didn't entirely disappear. In the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, and later in the Islamic world, ancient Greek and Roman medical texts were preserved, studied, and even expanded upon. Texts by Hippocrates and Galen, for example, were considered authoritative for centuries. These two physicians laid down ideas about the human body that became foundational for medieval medical theory. Galen in particular believed in the concept of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, which had to remain in balance for a person to stay healthy. Sickness, in this view, was caused by an imbalance of these humors, and treatments were designed to restore that balance. Bleeding, purging, and the use of herbs were all common strategies based on this theory. But while the West was descending into what many have called the Dark Ages, the Islamic world was experiencing a scientific and cultural flourishing. Scholars in cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo translated, commented on, and preserved the medical texts of antiquity. They also made their own contributions. One of the most influential figures was Avicenna, also known as Ibn Sina, whose work, The Canon of Medicine, became a standard textbook in both the Islamic world and Christian Europe well into the 17th century. Medieval European medicine slowly began to recover, thanks in part to contact with the Islamic world through trade, war, and the Crusades. In the 12th and 13th centuries, centers of translation in places like Toledo in Spain brought Arabic medical texts into Latin. This reintroduction of ancient and new knowledge helped form the basis of medical education in medieval universities. Still, the medicine practiced in medieval Europe was deeply shaped by the Christian worldview. Illness was often seen as a punishment for sin or a test of faith. Many believed that suffering had a spiritual purpose. Healing, therefore, was not just a physical matter, but also a religious one. Monasteries played a central role in medical care. Monks copied and preserved medical texts and tended to the sick in infirmaries. They grew medicinal herbs in monastery gardens and followed routines that combined prayer, fasting, and natural remedies. However, the Church's influence also placed limits on medical inquiry. Dissection of human bodies, for example, was controversial and often forbidden, at least officially, for many centuries. This limited understanding of human anatomy and slowed the development of more accurate medical knowledge. But even within these constraints, practical knowledge persisted and sometimes evolved. Midwives, herbalists, and barber surgeons filled the gaps left by university-trained physicians. Much of their knowledge was empirical, based on trial, error, and oral tradition. It's important to understand that medieval medicine was not a single unified system. It was a mosaic. Learned physicians, monks, local healers, and traveling practitioners all offered different types of care, with different tools, levels of education, and philosophies. A nobleman might consult a university-trained physician schooled in Galen, while a peasant might rely on a village herbalist who had never seen a book. The tools of diagnosis and treatment were also limited by the time's technology. Doctors examined urine color and smell, took the pulse, and observed symptoms, but without modern tools, their conclusions were often speculative. Treatments included herbal concoctions, charms, prayers, bloodletting, cupping, and even astrology. Some physicians cast horoscopes for their patients, believing that celestial bodies influenced health and illness. Despite these limitations, some remedies were surprisingly effective. Many herbs used in medieval times, such as willow bark for pain, which contains a chemical similar to aspirin, have real pharmacological value. And while some practices, like using leeches or applying cow dung poultices, might seem absurd today, they often reflected attempts to follow the logic of humoral theory and balance bodily fluids. Medicine in this period was not only practiced by men. Women played a crucial but often overlooked role, particularly in domestic medicine. They acted as caregivers, midwives, and keepers of herbal knowledge passed down through generations. In many cases, they were the first and only line of healthcare in rural communities. Some women, like Hildegard of Bingen, also contributed written works on healing and medicinal plants, blending Christian mysticism with practical observation. In the absence of centralized healthcare systems, medicine in the Middle Ages was personal, local, and deeply intertwined with religion, tradition, and social class. A person's access to care and the type of care they received depended on where they lived, how much money they had, and what kind of worldview they and their healers shared. The legacy of ancient medicine, the influence of religious belief, the transmission of knowledge through Islamic scholars, and the practical experience of countless unnamed healers all shaped the medical landscape of the medieval world. Though far from modern standards, medieval medicine was a living, evolving system, complex, diverse, and surprisingly human in its mixture of insight, error, and enduring hope. In the medieval world, illness was a part of daily life. People of all ages and social classes suffered from diseases that today would be easily preventable or treatable. But without an understanding of germs, sanitation, or modern pharmaceuticals, medieval medical practice was focused on observation, tradition, and balancing the body's humors. Each disease was seen not just as a biological event, but often as a spiritual or moral one. Let's begin with one of the most feared and misunderstood conditions, the plague. The Black Death struck Europe in the 14th century and wiped out a third of its population. People had no idea what caused it. They blamed everything from bad air, what they called miasma, to the alignment of the planets or even divine punishment. Treatments included fumigating homes with herbs, carrying sweet-smelling flowers, or whipping oneself in public as a form of penance. Some physicians wore the now infamous beaked masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, thinking this would protect them from disease. These efforts, of course, did little to stop the spread of the plague, which we now know was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted by fleas on rats. Other common diseases included smallpox, leprosy, dysentery, tuberculosis, and ergotism, a poisoning caused by consuming contaminated rye. Each came with its own set of fears and folk beliefs. Leprosy, for example, was deeply stigmatized. It was seen not only as a physical affliction, but as a mark of moral corruption. Lepers were often expelled from their communities and made to live in isolated colonies. They were sometimes even required to wear special clothing or carry a bell to warn others of their presence. Though now we understand that leprosy is only mildly contagious and treatable, in the Middle Ages, it was one of the most feared diseases. Medieval treatments for these diseases varied widely, often depending on the resources available and the education of the healer. For example, someone suffering from a high fever might be given a drink made from boiled herbs like sage or chamomile. Bleeding was another common treatment. A physician might make small cuts in a patient's veins or use leeches to draw blood. The idea was to remove excess blood and restore the balance of humors. Headaches and migraines were treated with everything from cold compresses and herbal salves to strange-sounding recipes involving crushed beetles or ground pearls. For toothaches, one might be given a concoction of vinegar, salt, and pepper, or even have the offending tooth burned with a hot iron. Surgery, when performed, was usually a last resort. Without effective anesthesia or antiseptics, procedures were incredibly painful and often fatal due to infection. Amputations were done quickly, sometimes with a saw, and cauterized with red-hot irons to stop the bleeding. Infectious diseases were frequently treated with a mix of superstition and herbal remedies. Garlic was thought to have purifying properties and was used to ward off illness. Honey, too, played an important role. It was used as a wound dressing due to its natural antibacterial effects. Other commonly used ingredients included mint, lavender, nettles, fennel, and yarrow. Healers kept herbals, books listing plants and their medical uses, often filled with beautiful but not always accurate illustrations. Astrology also played a role in diagnosis and treatment. Many doctors believed that the positions of the planets and stars at the time of a person's birth or the onset of their illness could influence their health. Medical charts called zodiac men showed which parts of the body were governed by which astrological signs. Physicians would consult these charts before performing treatments like bloodletting, making sure that the stars were favorable. Let's not forget the influence of religious practices. Pilgrimages to holy shrines were seen as potential cures for both body and soul. People visited places where saints were said to have performed healing miracles. Relics, such as bones, hair, or clothing of saints, were thought to hold divine power and were often touched or kissed in hope of a cure. Prayers, fasting, confession, and almsgiving were spiritual treatments recommended by priests alongside or instead of physical remedies. Mental illness, too, was poorly understood. Conditions like depression, epilepsy, or schizophrenia were often attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment. Treatments ranged from prayer and exorcism to imprisonment or physical punishment. In some monasteries, however, more compassionate care was offered. Monks would talk to and comfort the mentally ill, offer herbal sedatives, and maintain a quiet environment. One of the more unusual categories of treatment was the use of charms, amulets, and magic spells. These might be worn around the neck, hidden in clothing, or even consumed. A common belief was that certain words or symbols held protective power. Though these methods seem unscientific to us today, for people of the time, they were part of a broader worldview in which the physical, spiritual, and symbolic were deeply intertwined. Perhaps what is most striking about medieval medicine is its mixture of knowledge and guesswork, ritual and reason. People did the best they could with what they had, using observation, tradition, and a desire to heal in whatever ways they knew. Some of their methods were surprisingly effective, while others were, frankly, dangerous or useless. But taken together, they offer us a rich portrait of how humans across time have tried to understand and manage the suffering of illness. In the next part, we'll explore how medical education worked in the Middle Ages, who got to become a doctor, what they studied, and how they learned their craft. In the medieval world, becoming a physician was no small task. Unlike today, where medical schools follow a structured, scientific curriculum, medieval medical education was rooted in tradition, philosophy, and the rediscovery of ancient texts. For those few who were lucky and wealthy enough to pursue such a path, the journey to becoming a doctor could take many years. Medical education in Europe was closely tied to the rise of universities. Some of the most important centers of learning emerged in cities like Salerno, Bologna, Montpellier, and later Paris and Oxford. These universities were often supported by the church, and their curriculum reflected a deeply religious worldview. Students began by studying the liberal arts, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, before moving on to medicine. This meant that physicians were often as much scholars as they were healers. The foundation of medieval medical learning was based largely on ancient authorities. Chief among these were Hippocrates and Galen, two Greek physicians whose ideas had been preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars like Avicenna, Razis, and Al-Zarawi. When these works were translated into Latin during the 11th and 12th centuries, they sparked a renewed interest in scientific medicine in Western Europe. One of the most influential texts was Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, a massive encyclopedia that covered everything from anatomy and symptoms to treatment methods and pharmacology. It became a standard medical textbook for centuries. But it wasn't just read, it was memorized, commented on, and debated in lecture halls. Learning medicine wasn't about experimentation or observation. It was about mastering the knowledge of those who came before. Classes were taught in Latin, and students listened to lectures while the master read aloud from ancient texts. Practical hands-on training was rare. Dissection of human bodies was controversial and often forbidden, though it did occur from time to time under special permission, usually with the cadaver of an executed criminal. Most anatomical knowledge, however, came from texts rather than direct observation. This sometimes led to misunderstandings or inaccuracies in understanding the human body. After several years of study, often up to 10, students would take exams, sometimes orally, and if they passed, they would earn a degree. With that, they could officially call themselves physicians. But even then, their education was not considered complete. Many continued to study and write for the rest of their lives, contributing to the ongoing debates about health, illness, and treatment. Not everyone who practiced medicine had such formal education. In fact, university-trained physicians were in the minority. Their services were expensive, and their clientele was usually limited to the nobility, clergy, or wealthy merchants. For the vast majority of people, healthcare came from local healers, apothecaries, midwives, monks, and barbers. The barber surgeons, in particular, had an unusual dual role. They cut hair, pulled teeth, drained boils, set broken bones, and even performed minor surgeries. Unlike university doctors, their skills were gained through apprenticeship and hands-on experience. Many people trusted them more than distant scholars because they actually got results, even if they worked without formal credentials. Midwives were also essential, especially for women. They helped with childbirth, managed complications, and provided postpartum care. Some had considerable knowledge of herbal remedies and practical anatomy, passed down from one generation to the next. Yet because they were women and often lacked formal education, they were not always respected by the male-dominated medical establishment. Apothecaries, on the other hand, were responsible for preparing and selling medicines. Their shops were filled with jars of dried herbs, oils, minerals, and sometimes exotic ingredients like powdered horn or crushed insects. They followed recipes from herbals or pharmacopoeias and worked closely with both doctors and patients. In some ways, they were the pharmacists of their time. There were also monastic infirmaries, often attached to abbeys or monasteries. These were among the few places where the poor could receive free care. Monks kept gardens filled with medicinal plants and followed herbal texts like the herbarium of Apuleius. They believed that healing the body was part of their spiritual duty. The combination of prayer, rest, and herbal treatment formed the core of monastic care. But despite all these paths, becoming a respected physician still required formal training, connections, and often approval from local or royal authorities. Licenses to practice were sometimes issued by universities, city councils, or even bishops. In some cities, you couldn't legally treat patients without one. This helped regulate the profession, but also excluded many skilled practitioners who hadn't followed the university route. And so, medieval medicine remained a layered and unequal system. At the top were the university-trained physicians, draped in robes, speaking Latin, and quoting Aristotle or Galen. Below them were the barbers, apothecaries, midwives, and local healers, who often had more practical experience but less prestige. Each had their place, and together they formed a patchwork of care, some scientific, some superstitious, and all shaped by the culture and values of the time. In the next part, we'll take a closer look at the hospitals of the Middle Ages, what they look like, who worked there, and what kind of care patients actually received when they entered through their doors. When we hear the word hospital today, we might imagine sterile hallways, white coats, and beeping machines. But in the Middle Ages, hospitals were very different places. They were not centers of cutting-edge medical treatment, nor were they primarily focused on curing disease. Rather, they were places of shelter, compassion, and spiritual care. The word hospital comes from the Latin hospes, meaning guest or host, and that's a clue to how medieval people thought about these institutions. Hospitals were less about advanced medicine and more about offering hospitality to the sick, the poor, the elderly, travelers, orphans, and even lepers. In many cases, hospitals functioned more like charitable hostels than what we would now call a clinic. Most medieval hospitals were founded by religious orders, wealthy nobles, or city governments, often as acts of piety. Running a hospital was considered a good Christian deed, something that might help the soul of a founder in the afterlife. Monasteries played a key role early on, especially during the early medieval period, when there were few public institutions. Later, more secular hospitals began to emerge in growing towns and cities. A typical medieval hospital was a long, open hall, sometimes with high wooden ceilings and rows of beds lining the walls. Beds might be shared by 2 or more patients, especially during times of crisis or plague. There was little privacy and no separation by disease. The focus was on comfort and salvation, rather than isolation or quarantine. At the end of the hall, there was often an altar or chapel. Attending Mass, hearing sermons, and receiving confession were considered just as important as any physical treatment. In fact, many hospitals saw illness as a test of faith or even a divine punishment for sin. Healing, therefore, was often spiritual in nature. The patient's soul needed care just as much as, if not more than, their body. Who worked in these hospitals? Often, the staff included monks, nuns, or other religious lay people who devoted their lives to service. They would prepare food, clean wounds, administer herbal remedies, and tend to the dying. These caregivers were not always trained in formal medicine, but they followed established routines, some of which were surprisingly effective. Nursing in particular was seen as a form of religious devotion. The famous Hospitallers of St. John, for instance, combined military and medical missions during the Crusades, offering care to Christian pilgrims and the wounded. In many hospitals, female religious figures, such as nuns, played a vital role in managing daily operations and providing compassionate care. The kinds of treatments offered varied widely. Patients might receive warm meals, clean sheets, herbal teas, and basic wound care. For fevers, they might be given infusions of chamomile or willow bark. For stomach issues, a mix of mint or fennel. But again, the goal wasn't necessarily to cure, but to comfort. The hospitals also housed the chronically ill and the elderly. Some patients stayed for months, others for years. In many ways, the hospital was a community within a community, a place where those cast out or left behind could find shelter and dignity in their final days. One of the more unique institutions of the Middle Ages was the leper hospital, or leprosarium. Leprosy, known today as Hansen's disease, carried immense social stigma. Victims were often forced to live apart from society, sometimes in remote colonies or special hospitals outside city walls. These places were intended not just for treatment, but for segregation. Leprosy wasn't the only illness feared in this way. During outbreaks of plague, some hospitals closed their doors entirely, while others were converted into temporary shelters for the infected. The Black Death in the 14th century overwhelmed many urban hospitals, and the response was often chaotic and desperate. Still, in the face of such terror, some caregivers stayed behind, tending to the dying at great personal risk. Despite their limitations, medieval hospitals represented a kind of social safety net. They reflected a worldview in which caring for the weak was not only a moral obligation, but a religious one. While they couldn't offer the technologies of modern medicine, they provided warmth, food, rest, and a sense of human presence. Interestingly, hospitals were also places of record keeping. Some kept detailed registers of patients, donations, supplies, and daily operations. These documents give modern historians valuable insights into how these institutions function. We learn, for example, that diet was carefully monitored. Patients might be given special foods, broths, porridges, or soft bread, depending on their condition. Meat was often reserved for the weak or those near death. Over time, hospitals began to professionalize. Some started employing surgeons or hiring physicians to visit patients, especially in larger urban centers. Still, the division between medical and spiritual care remained blurred. The line between doctor and priest, medicine and mercy, was not always clear, and for many it didn't need to be. By the late Middle Ages, hospitals had become fixtures in many cities and towns. Some were small, with just a handful of beds. Others were large complexes with hundreds of patients. They were places of contradiction, both hope and despair, comfort and suffering, piety and pragmatism. In the next part, we'll explore how medieval society responded to one of the greatest medical disasters in history, the Black Death. How did they understand it? How did they try to fight it? And what did it leave behind in the collective memory of a wounded world? In the year 1347, something terrible arrived in Europe. It came by ship, by road, and by breath. The people who saw it coming could not name it, but they knew it brought death. This was the beginning of what we now call the Black Death, the deadliest pandemic in human history. The disease struck quickly and without mercy. People would wake up healthy in the morning and be dead by nightfall. Swellings the size of apples grew under the arms and around the groin. Fevers burned through the body, vomiting, delirium, blackened fingers and toes. In just a few short years, between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population would be gone. But what did medieval people think was happening? They didn't know about bacteria or fleas or rats. Germ theory wouldn't exist for another 500 years. So explanations had to come from the frameworks they understood: astrology, religion, and humoral theory. Many believed the plague was a punishment from God, a sign of divine wrath, perhaps for sins committed by society at large. Others pointed to the stars and planetary alignments. In 1345, a rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had occurred. Some physicians believed this celestial event had corrupted the air, making it poisonous and deadly. This concept of bad air, or miasma, was a common explanation. People thought the plague was carried through foul smells or invisible vapors. To protect themselves, they lit fires, burned incense, and carried herbs like rosemary or lavender. Some wore sweet-smelling sponges under their noses. Others walked around with bouquets of flowers or crushed herbs in their hands. This is where the infamous plague doctor costume comes in. Although it became more common in later outbreaks, it reflected these same beliefs. The beaked mask, filled with fragrant herbs, was meant to filter out poisonous air. The long robe and gloves protected the body, while the cane was used to examine patients from a distance. Treatments were, understandably, limited. Bloodletting, purging, applying poultices to the buboes. Nothing seemed to work. Some doctors recommended avoiding baths, believing that open pores made one vulnerable to disease. Others advised extreme diets or drinking vinegar. But no matter the method, death came quickly and often. Hospitals, as we discussed earlier, were overwhelmed. Many simply shut their doors. Entire towns were left without clergy, doctors, or gravediggers. Corpses piled in the streets. In some places, carts rolled through neighborhoods collecting the dead. Burial pits stretched across the countryside, hastily dug and quickly filled. Fear and desperation gave rise to strange behaviors. Some people turned to extreme piety. Flagellants, for example, roamed from town to town, whipping themselves in public to atone for mankind's sins. Others abandoned all morality and lived in reckless indulgence, believing the end was near anyway. There were also darker reactions. Minority groups, particularly Jews, were scapegoated and blamed for poisoning wells or spreading disease. In many cities, this led to horrific massacres and forced expulsions. Fear bred violence, and reason gave way to superstition and cruelty. And yet, through all of this, medieval medicine tried to understand. Some physicians began recording their observations, how the disease spread, its symptoms, and possible methods of prevention. Treatises were written, letters exchanged. There was an effort, however small, to learn from the horror. One notable example comes from the University of Paris, where a group of doctors produced a detailed report on the plague. They cited astrology, corrupt air, and environmental factors. While their conclusions were wrong by modern standards, the process, gathering data, forming theories, sharing ideas, was an early glimpse of medical inquiry. In Italy, the city of Pistoia issued strict public health ordinances. These included banning the sale of second-hand clothes from infected homes, restricting funeral practices, and even limiting travel into the city. Venice created a system of quarantine, a word that comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Ships arriving from infected ports were required to wait offshore before passengers could enter the city. It was one of the first attempts at institutional disease control. Out of chaos, some structures began to emerge. The Black Death also had profound effects on the society at large. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Peasants could demand better wages. Entire villages were abandoned. The rigid hierarchies of feudalism began to crack. In some ways, this catastrophe pushed medieval Europe toward the modern age. But for medicine, the lessons were mixed. On the one hand, the failure to prevent or cure the plague exposed the limits of existing knowledge. Trust in physicians waned. In many cases, people turned away from science and back toward spiritual explanations. On the other hand, the devastation forced cities to rethink public health. The concept of disease as something that could be tracked, managed, even contained, began to take root. In the centuries that followed, Europe would face many more plagues, but the memory of the Black Death never faded. It haunted the art, literature, and imagination of the medieval world. Skeletons danced across frescoes, grim reapers crept into poetry, and the ghost of the pestilence lingered in every city street and village chapel. Even today, historians and scientists continue to study this moment. It reminds us how fragile life can be, how societies respond to crisis, and how medicine, even in its infancy, seeks to understand the unknown. In the next part, we'll look at surgery in the Middle Ages, who performed it, how it was done, and what it meant to go under the knife without anesthesia or antibiotics. In medieval Europe, surgery was considered a lower form of medicine, practical, brutal, and often avoided by the more educated physicians. University-trained doctors, fluent in Latin and steeped in ancient theory, rarely dirtied their hand with blood. Instead, they prescribed herbal mixtures or recommended balancing the humors. Surgery, by contrast, was left to barbers, craftspeople, and battlefield improvisers. The barber-surgeon was a familiar figure. His skills were varied and practical, cutting hair, letting blood, pulling teeth, and setting bones. He might lance a boil in the morning and give someone a shave in the afternoon. The iconic red and white pole, still seen outside barbershops, traces back to this blend of tasks. Red symbolizing blood, white for the bandages, and the pole itself representing the staff the patient gripped during a procedure. Training for surgery came not from books, but through apprenticeship. A young man might learn by assisting an older surgeon, gradually picking up the methods, observing how to bandage a wound or cauterize a cut. Over time, he'd gain the confidence to perform procedures on his own. There were no standardized qualifications, and the outcomes varied wildly. Some surgeries saved lives, others hastened death. Pain management was rudimentary. Alcohol was sometimes used to dull the senses, and opium, when available, offered brief relief. But often the patient was simply held down by several men while the operation was carried out. The experience was terrifying and traumatic. Speed was essential, especially during amputations. Surgeons trained themselves to complete a leg amputation in under a minute. Every second mattered. Amputations were among the most common surgical interventions, especially after battles or infections. A tight tourniquet was applied to slow bleeding. The flesh and muscle were cut swiftly, followed by the sawing of bone. Once the limb was removed, the stump was cauterized with a hot iron or treated with boiling oil or pitch. Even when the procedure was technically successful, the real danger lay ahead: infection. Many patients died days later from sepsis. The tools used were few but deadly effective: scalpels, saws, hooks, probes, and forceps. There were no sterilization procedures. A blade might be reused within minutes on another patient. Blood stained the aprons, and hands were washed, if at all, with water. The idea of invisible germs wouldn't arise for centuries. Even so, some surgeons developed a sort of practical hygiene, cleaning wounds with wine or honey, which had mild antiseptic properties, even if they didn't fully understand why it helped. In rural communities, surgery often became a family affair. A local healer, wise woman, or even a blacksmith might be called to remove an infected nail or set a broken bone. Surgical knowledge, if it existed at all, was passed down orally. Recipes for ointments, herbal poultices, and soothing teas were handed from parent to child, often guarded as family secrets. Despite the dangers, some patients recovered. The human body, even in medieval conditions, could show remarkable resilience. Clean wounds sometimes healed, bones mended. There are records of patients surviving trepanation, the removal of part of the skull, if done carefully. Skulls from the period show signs of healing, indicating that the person lived weeks, months, even years after the operation. There were also traveling surgeons, itinerant men who moved from town to town offering their services. They'd set up in marketplaces or near churches, advertising their skills to curious crowds. Sometimes they were quacks, offering miraculous cures. But others were genuine, if unorthodox, professionals who had spent years learning through practice. Their surgeries were public, often attracting onlookers. Successes built their reputations. Failures sent them fleeing. Military campaigns, for all their horror, pushed surgical knowledge forward. Wounds caused by arrows, axes, and maces needed immediate care. Army surgeons developed practical ways of treating injuries, improvising as needed. Field hospitals, primitive tents near the battlefield, became places of hurried surgery and hope. Lessons learned during war slowly filtered into civilian life. In urban centers like Bologna, Montpellier, and Paris, surgical knowledge began to formalize. Universities introduced anatomy courses. Students watched as bodies, often those of executed criminals, were dissected in lecture halls. Professors read from classical texts while assistants pointed to organs. Dissections were rare, but each one offered a glimpse into the body's internal map. For surgeons, this new understanding was revolutionary. Guy de Chauliac, a 14th century French surgeon, wrote one of the most important surgical texts of the era, the Chirurgia Magna. He combined ancient medical theory with personal observation, describing how to treat fractures, wounds, and even tumors. Though deeply rooted in Galenic ideas, he also insisted on the value of dissection and empirical observation. His book was copied for centuries and became a standard reference well into the Renaissance. Still, tension lingered between physicians and surgeons. Physicians wore long robes and spoke in Latin. Surgeons wore aprons stained with blood. The divide was as much about class and education as it was about technique. Over time, some surgeons gained more recognition, but many remained outside the elite circles of academic medicine. And yet they kept working. On battlefields, in villages, in smoky back rooms lit by candlelight. They stitched and bandaged. They cut and hoped. They learned, not from books, but from scars, both their patients and their own. The history of medieval surgery is not one of shining success. It is a story of pain, trial, and survival against the odds. But in this rough and often thankless field, the roots of modern surgery were slowly taking hold. While formal medicine in medieval Europe was dominated by men, university-trained physicians, monks in monastery infirmaries, barber surgeons, much of the everyday healing was done by women. Quietly, persistently, and often without recognition, women shaped the health of their communities. They did so not with official titles or degrees, but with knowledge passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, and patient to patient. Midwives were among the most vital of these women. In a world where childbirth was fraught with danger, they offered support, guidance, and comfort. They knew when to apply warm compresses, how to position a laboring woman, how to ease the pain with herbal infusions, and what prayers to whisper when things grew tense. In most villages, the local midwife was trusted more than any wandering doctor. She knew the mothers. She had delivered the children. She had seen death and life in equal measure. Training for midwifery was informal but rich in experience. A young woman might begin by observing an older midwife, helping to clean cloths, fetch water, or calm the family. Over time, she'd learn the signs of a healthy pregnancy and a troubled one. She'd learn how to turn a breech baby, how to massage a womb after delivery, how to tie the umbilical cord with thread boiled in wine. These were not academic lessons. They were lived, deeply embodied knowledge. But midwives walked a delicate line. While their skills were valued, they also stirred unease. In a deeply religious society, the idea of a woman wielding knowledge, especially knowledge of the body, was sometimes seen as suspicious. If a baby died, rumors might spread. If a difficult birth ended in tragedy, the midwife might be blamed. Accusations of witchcraft, though not as common as myths suggest, were a real and growing danger, especially in later centuries. Beyond childbirth, women served as herbalists and healers. They gathered plants from forests, fields, and gardens, knowing which leaves could soothe a fever, which roots stopped bleeding, and which berries were deadly. Their remedies were often practical and effective. Elderflower for colds, yarrow for wounds, chamomile for sleeplessness. These women might have no formal title, but they had authority, especially in places where no physician would ever visit. Some women created medicinal salves and poultices, blending beeswax with herbs and oils. Others brewed syrups and tinctures, soaking plants in wine or vinegar. Recipes were often kept secret or passed down only within families. Sometimes these women were called wise women, respected in their communities, turned to in times of illness or injury. But the very term wise woman could shift in tone depending on who was speaking. In some mouths it was praise, in others, accusation. Church authorities watched these healers with suspicion. Medicine, they believed, should be guided by divine truth, not local tradition. And women, especially poor, unmarried, or outspoken ones, were easy targets for moral judgment. The line between healer and heretic was dangerously thin. Inquisitors sometimes questioned midwives about the prayers they used during childbirth or the symbols they drew on the floor. Anything that seemed too old, too mystical, or too independent of church doctrine was labeled suspect. This tension became more intense in the later medieval period, especially as university medicine tried to assert its dominance. Male physicians often viewed female healers as competitors, untrained, uncontrolled, and dangerously popular. Some wrote treatises warning against trusting old women's remedies. Others accused them of spreading superstition. The result was a gradual marginalization of women's medical roles, even as they continued to serve their communities. Still, some women defied these limits and found ways to gain recognition. In Southern Europe, particularly in Salerno, a few women were allowed to study medicine. One of the most famous was Trota of Salerno, a 12th century medical writer whose texts on women's health were widely read. Though later historians tried to erase her by claiming Trota was a mistake or a mythical figure, modern scholarship has uncovered real manuscripts with her name. Her works offered practical advice on menstruation, fertility, childbirth, and female illness, a rare female voice in a male-dominated field. Women also found roles within convents. Nuns ran infirmaries, prepared medicines, and wrote medical texts. The convent was one of the few spaces where a woman could read, write, and practice healing in relative safety. Some nuns became respected healers, known for their kindness and skill. They blended spiritual care with physical healing, treating both the soul and the body. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, mystic, and herbalist, wrote extensively on natural medicine. Her texts combined religious insight with practical knowledge of plants and health. But these exceptions were rare. Most women in medieval medicine worked quietly, often anonymously. They had no diplomas, no official recognition. Their knowledge came from touch, from observation, from care. They learned by doing. And despite the obstacles, they were often the first and last line of care for the sick and suffering. Their legacy lives on, though it's easy to overlook. Hidden behind monastery walls or buried beneath accusations of witchcraft, their contributions remain harder to trace than those of university doctors. But without them, medieval medicine would have been far more brutal, far more limited, and far more lonely. As cities faltered and empires fractured in the early medieval centuries, the work of healing did not vanish. It simply moved behind stone walls. Cloisters became the sanctuaries of knowledge, and within monasteries, medicine found a quiet, persistent rhythm. Monks and nuns were not only the guardians of spiritual health, but often the primary caregivers for physical ailments as well. In the silence of the scriptorium, medical texts were copied, preserved, and sometimes translated. The rule of Saint Benedict, the foundation of Western monastic life, encouraged care for the sick as a central religious duty. It instructed that the monastery should contain an infirmary and that the care of the ill should be handled with the same devotion as prayer. Thus emerged the monastic hospital, not a hospital as we know it today, but a modest space where the poor and the ill might find a bed, warm broth, and simple herbal remedies. The monks who tended to them were not formally trained physicians, but they were literate, disciplined, and guided by centuries-old texts inherited from Roman and early Christian traditions. One such text was the Herbarium of Apuleius, which described the use of plants in healing, from mint to mugwort. Another was the Physica by Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, whose work combined herbal lore, spiritual insight, and empirical observation. Her writings reflect a worldview where health was inseparable from faith and where disease was seen as both a physical and moral imbalance. In monasteries, the garden was not only a place of beauty, but a living pharmacy. Carefully cultivated herbs like sage, rosemary, chamomile, and comfrey grew in orderly beds, tended by hands that also turned pages of parchment. Recipes were passed down often orally for poultices, salves, teas, and syrups. Many of these were surprisingly effective, though no doubt some were hopeful at best. At the heart of monastic healing was a blend of ancient Greco-Roman theory and Christian theology. Galen's ideas of the four humors still dominated understanding: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each corresponding to temperaments and elements. An imbalance of humors could, it was believed, be corrected by diet, purging, or applying specific plants. But monks also believed that sin and divine punishment could cause illness. Healing, therefore, required both treatment and prayer. Monastic libraries were some of the few places in Europe where ancient medical knowledge was preserved during the so-called Dark Ages. Manuscripts from Hippocrates, Galen, and Dioscorides were copied laboriously by hand, often decorated with illustrations of plants and diagrams of the body. These libraries became the roots from which later medical schools would grow. Interestingly, women were also part of this medical continuity. Female monastics, nuns and abbesses, often managed infirmaries within convents. Some, like Hildegard, wrote extensively about the body, healing, and the soul. Though constrained by religious roles, their contributions to healthcare were real and significant. Yet monastic medicine was not without limitations. Surgery was rarely practiced. It was considered too bloody, too physical, and often beneath the dignity of spiritual healers. The more dangerous or invasive procedures were left to lay surgeons or barbers in towns, while monasteries focused on the sick, the elderly, and the chronically ill. Moreover, belief in miracles and relics sometimes overshadowed more rational care. Pilgrimages to holy shrines were promoted as cures. People suffering from epilepsy, blindness, or plague might travel for weeks to touch the bones of a saint or bathe in a sacred spring. Whether these journeys healed the body or only soothed the soul is difficult to say. Still, monastic medicine created a bridge between ancient wisdom and future discovery. It gave structure to care, preserved valuable knowledge, and instilled a sense of duty to the sick that would influence later medical ethics. In a world of uncertainty, monks and nuns provided constancy, not always effective by modern standards, but often deeply compassionate. As the medieval centuries wore on and towns began to flourish once more, monastic medicine would be both a memory and a foundation. The texts they saved would feed the minds of new physicians. The gardens they tended would inspire apothecaries. And the notion that caring for the sick is a sacred calling would echo long after the bells stopped ringing. While medieval European medicine was heavily shaped by religious doctrine, it was not entirely immune to external influences. In fact, one of the most significant periods of transformation occurred through interactions with the Islamic world during the Crusades and through trade. What emerged was a gradual reawakening, a slow, deliberate merging of ancient wisdom and new perspectives that would, over time, nudge Western medicine toward progress. Muslim scholars had preserved and translated countless medical texts lost to Europe, and in many cases improved upon them. Thinkers such as Avicenna, also known as Ibn Sina, wrote works that became foundational in both East and West. His canon of medicine was translated into Latin in the 12th century and studied in European universities for centuries thereafter. It combined Greek, Roman, and Arabic medical theories into a single, systematic work, structured, reasoned, and often astonishingly modern. From these texts, medieval European doctors began to reconsider their own frameworks. The humoral theory still persisted, but new emphasis was placed on observation, categorization, and dosage. There was a growing sense that illness could be studied, not simply endured. Translation centers in places like Toledo and Salerno became intellectual crossroads. Monks, clerics, and early scholars worked alongside Jewish and Muslim translators, converting Arabic texts into Latin. These collaborative efforts didn't just expand libraries, they expanded minds. In Salerno, the so-called Scola Medica Salernitana developed a reputation as one of the earliest medical schools in Western Europe. It accepted both male and female students, an unusual fact for the time, and drew medical knowledge from Greek, Roman, Arab, and Jewish sources. The school produced handbooks such as the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, a widely circulated health guide written in verse, aimed at educating nobles and clergy on maintaining well-being. Despite these advances, most of the population still relied on local healers, herbalists, and clergy. The academic medicine developing in universities and scriptoria remained inaccessible to the average person. Hospitals were rare, and those that existed were often more charitable than curative, focusing on care of the soul more than care of the body. But change had begun. The 13th century saw the establishment of more organized universities, Paris, Bologna, Montpellier, where medicine was taught formally, using texts from Galen, Hippocrates, and newer Islamic authors. There, students copied diagrams of the human body, studied disease classification, and debated causes of fevers and plagues. Anatomy, however, was still mostly theoretical. Dissection was rare, often discouraged, and sometimes outright forbidden. And yet, in the quiet corners of Europe, physicians began to question what could not be seen. If disease was truly the result of imbalance or divine punishment, why did some remedies seem to help? Why did some herbs consistently reduce fevers, or certain foods restore appetite? There was no scientific method yet, no clinical trials, only slow accumulation of pattern and experience. Within monasteries, some monks kept detailed case notes, rudimentary patient histories, noting symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. These were humble beginnings of a medical record. Though imperfect, they demonstrated a quiet curiosity, a willingness to learn from what the body did, rather than just what the church taught. And meanwhile, in cities growing more crowded and unsanitary, the need for practical medicine became more urgent. Urban doctors, often trained in new university systems, tried to apply their theories to real-world problems: wounds, childbirth, infections, epidemics. They were still limited by outdated theories, but they were moving, slowly, toward medicine grounded not only in doctrine, but in daily human experience. In the mid-14th century, something catastrophic swept through Europe, changing not only its population, but also its ideas about health, medicine, and mortality itself. The Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, arrived with the quiet approach of merchant ships and spread with devastating speed. Between 1347 and 1351, it is estimated that between 1/3 to half of Europe's population perished. Entire towns were emptied, streets filled with silence, and medicine, as people knew it, proved helpless. The plague challenged every belief. Doctors could not cure it. Prayers didn't stop it. Traditional methods like bloodletting or herbal poultices were ineffective and often dangerous. The balance of humors, the alignment of the planets, the influence of corrupted air, all the usual explanations offered no comfort when death came in days. And yet, in the midst of this despair, something changed. Cities began experimenting with new strategies. In Venice, ships were held in port for 40 days, a practice that gave rise to the term quarantine from the Italian quaranta giorni. Some towns erected early public health boards. Others recorded death tolls, tracked symptoms, or implemented rudimentary isolation methods. Though primitive, these actions marked the beginning of epidemiology. The idea that diseases could be traced, contained, and possibly even understood. It was no longer just divine punishment or bad luck. People began to suspect that sickness had patterns. One of the more iconic figures of this time was the plague doctor. Dressed in a long black cloak, gloves, and a beaked mask stuffed with aromatic herbs, he cut a grim and theatrical figure. The mask wasn't just for effect. It was believed the herbs would purify the air he breathed, warding off the miasma. In reality, plague doctors varied in competence. Some were trained physicians, but many were hired simply to record the dead or stay with the dying when no one else dared to. Their costume, frightening though it appears today, symbolized a shift, a physical barrier between doctor and disease. It was not modern medicine, but it hinted that medicine could adapt. Perhaps the greatest quiet revolution came with the body itself. Until now, dissection had been largely forbidden. The church viewed it with suspicion, and few physicians were willing or allowed to examine human anatomy firsthand. But the overwhelming scale of death and the failure of traditional methods weakened these taboos. In the wake of the plague, universities in cities like Bologna and Padua began allowing limited dissections. These were often public, conducted in cold lecture halls where a lecturer recited Galenic anatomy while a barber surgeon did the cutting. Sometimes the text didn't match the body. Observers took note. Questions began to emerge. What if Galen had been wrong? What if disease came not from cosmic imbalances, but from internal dysfunction? What if knowledge came not from books, but from bodies? The answers weren't yet clear, and change was slow. But the seed had been planted. The plague also shifted the way people thought about doctors. Before the 14th century, medicine had been a respectable but somewhat abstract profession. After the Black Death, patients, desperate for survival, demanded more from healers, and while many physicians still relied on old texts, a growing number began to value observation, recording symptoms, outcomes, and even patterns across populations. This wasn't yet science as we know it, but it was closer. In monasteries and cities alike, careful records were kept. Some chroniclers began distinguishing between types of plague: bubonic, pneumonic, septicemic. Others noticed it spread faster in crowded places. Some even began to suspect that the disease came from contact with the sick or from contaminated objects. These were dangerous thoughts, too close to blaming people or questioning divine will. But they were also the first signs of modern medical thinking. As the 14th century closed and the 15th began, Europe was bruised and wary. The plague had come and gone in waves. Cities had burned infected neighborhoods. Survivors bore physical and emotional scars. Yet something had shifted. No longer was sickness seen purely as punishment. It was becoming a problem to be studied. In the century to come, those early dissections would lead to anatomical breakthroughs. Those plague reports would evolve into statistics. The long-held grip of Galen and Hippocrates would finally begin to loosen. And in that space between death and understanding was born the idea that medicine could grow, quietly, slowly, but with purpose. As Europe gradually stepped out of the long medieval night, a new dawn began to rise. The 15th and 16th centuries brought not only a revival of classical learning, but also a growing confidence in human observation, experimentation, and the power of reason. This was the Renaissance, a time when medicine began to shift, not overnight, but unmistakably, from a world of inherited dogma to one of slow but steady discovery. One of the most significant changes was the emergence of anatomy as a respected field of study. Previously, the dissection of human bodies had been rare, difficult to arrange, and often frowned upon. But by the mid-15th century, especially in Italy, it was becoming a part of medical education. In universities like Padua and Bologna, students gathered in anatomical theaters, tiered circular chambers, where they watched dissections conducted before their eyes. A professor would read aloud from ancient texts, while a barber surgeon performed the incisions. Slowly, the words of Galen, written centuries before, were being tested against real human flesh. And this is where a Flemish physician named Andreas Vesalius enters the story. Born in 1514, Vesalius became one of the first to question the infallibility of ancient authorities. Trained in Louvain, Paris, and Padua, he took the unusual step of performing dissections himself rather than delegating them. What he found shocked him. The human body did not always match Galen's descriptions. That was no small matter. Galen's writings had been medical scripture for over 1,000 years. But Vesalius discovered that Galen's work had relied heavily on animal dissections. Monkeys, pigs, not humans. Bones, organs, even the placement of muscles were often wrong. In 1543, Vesalius published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, a richly illustrated, meticulously detailed book that redefined anatomy. It wasn't just a book of knowledge, it was a book of vision. The drawings were elegant, lifelike, almost artistic in their precision. For the first time, doctors and students could see the body as it truly was, not just described in words but drawn in ink. The human body became something to be understood through the senses, not just inherited through belief. This shift was amplified by the printing press, invented less than a century earlier by Johannes Gutenberg. Suddenly, books could be copied quickly, accurately, and distributed widely. Medical knowledge, once locked in monasteries or handwritten texts, began to circulate across Europe. Ideas no longer moved at the pace of a horse or ship. They moved at the pace of print. But even as anatomical knowledge grew, the actual treatment of illness remained stubbornly medieval. Most doctors still prescribed humoral balancing, bleeding, herbal mixtures, or dietary restrictions. The theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, still shaped diagnoses and treatments. Yet here and there, cracks began to appear. Some physicians began to take note of environmental factors, air, water, hygiene. Others studied specific diseases more closely, describing their symptoms in clinical detail. For example, Girolamo Fracastoro, an Italian scholar in the early 1500s, proposed that certain diseases might be caused by invisible particles, seminaria, that spread from person to person. This was not yet germ theory, but it was an important step in that direction. Fracastoro's idea was too speculative for most to accept, but it planted a seed. And while academic physicians explored these new ideas, another group continued their quiet work: the barber surgeons, midwives, and herbalists. These practitioners, often without university degrees, relied on practical experience, local traditions, and trial-and-error methods. They set bones, drained abscesses, delivered babies, and created poultices from plants. In some ways, their knowledge was more useful than that of their university-trained counterparts. They understood the body not through books, but through hands-on familiarity. And so for a time, two worlds of medicine coexisted, one of theory, books, and lectures, and another of experience, improvisation, and craft. Meanwhile, cities were growing. With growth came problems: crowded streets, poor sanitation, outbreaks of disease. Some municipalities began experimenting with public health regulations. Quarantines were enforced more strictly. Records of deaths and causes were kept. Waste disposal became a matter of law, not just etiquette. In places like London, plague outbreaks led to new practices: fumigating houses, marking doors with painted signs, and publishing bills of mortality. Even if these measures weren't based on modern science, they reflected an emerging idea: that public health was a matter of planning, not just prayer. And slowly, medicine began to transform from a tradition into a discipline, from a ritual into an inquiry. But change was uneven. In some regions, old ideas still held fast. Bloodletting remained common. Astrology still influenced treatment. Superstition and science mingled freely. There was no clear boundary between the two, just a long, slow shift of emphasis. And through it all, one constant remained: people were trying to understand their own bodies. Whether through dissection or observation, through books or hands-on practice, through failures and small successes, medicine was moving. Not in leaps, but in careful, quiet steps. The Renaissance did not cure disease, but it gave Europe the tools to begin asking better questions. And in those questions, scattered across books, drawings, and whispered theories, lay the roots of modern medicine. By the late Middle Ages, around the 14th and 15th centuries, European society began undergoing profound transformations. Cities were growing, trade was expanding, and with it, the infrastructure of knowledge. One of the most significant shifts in the medical world during this period was the emergence of more formalized structures of education and regulation. Medicine was no longer just in the hands of monks, wise women, and traveling healers. It was becoming institutionalized. Medical guilds began to form in urban centers. These were professional organizations that sought to regulate the practice of medicine and maintain standards. Much like the guilds of blacksmiths or carpenters, medical guilds controlled who could practice, how they trained, and under what conditions. They offered apprenticeships, examinations, and eventually licenses. Though often limited to urban elites, these guilds represented a significant move toward a regulated profession. At the same time, universities were beginning to produce a new class of physician, men trained in classical texts, scholastic philosophy, and theoretical medicine. Centers like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford developed prestigious faculties of medicine. However, their curriculum still leaned heavily on ancient authorities such as Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna. The emphasis remained on theory rather than hands-on experience. A university-trained doctor might be well-versed in humoral theory and able to debate the nature of illness at length, but less likely to have touched a patient or performed a procedure. This created a curious division of labor. Physicians, educated and often aristocratic, diagnosed and prescribed. Barber surgeons who lacked formal university training performed surgeries, amputations, and bloodletting. Apothecaries prepared the medications, and midwives, still largely outside the official system, attended births and provided care to women and infants. Each group had its own domain, but tensions often arose over authority, legality, and social standing. One of the key developments of the era was the rise of municipal hospitals. These were no longer just religious institutions for the poor and dying. Increasingly, hospitals began to serve as places of care, staffed by both clerics and laypeople. In cities like Florence and London, hospitals were funded by wealthy patrons and designed with specific wards for different types of illness. Though still rooted in Christian charity, they began to resemble early healthcare systems. Meanwhile, medical licensing began to emerge in various forms. In some regions, such as Sicily and parts of Spain, laws required practitioners to be examined and approved before treating patients. These efforts were not always consistent or enforced, but they marked the beginning of state involvement in public health and professional oversight. Another fascinating trend was the increasing availability of medical texts, thanks to the spread of the printing press in the mid-15th century. What had once been handwritten and closely guarded knowledge could now be reproduced and disseminated widely. Medical manuals, herbals, and translated ancient works circulated among literate practitioners and curious laypeople alike. With print came democratization, not complete, but notable. Still, for all this progress, many old beliefs persisted. Astrology remained a central tool in diagnosis and treatment. Medical charts linked the signs of the zodiac to parts of the body, and doctors would time procedures according to celestial positions. The influence of the church, too, remained strong. Illness was still often seen as a test of faith or a punishment for sin. Hospitals had chapels. Patients were urged to confess before treatment. And then there was the question of women. Despite their critical roles in healing, midwifery, and herbal medicine, women increasingly found themselves pushed to the margins. With the rise of male-dominated institutions, guilds, universities, and regulated hospitals, female healers were often excluded or even criminalized. Accusations of witchcraft, particularly in the later 15th century, were sometimes directed at women who dared to practice medicine outside the sanctioned system. And then there was the question of women. Despite their critical roles in healing, midwifery, and herbal medicine, women increasingly found themselves pushed to the margins. With the rise of male-dominated institutions, guilds, universities, and regulated hospitals, female healers were often excluded or even criminalized. Accusations of witchcraft, particularly in the later 15th century, were sometimes directed at women who dared to practice medicine outside the sanctioned system. Yet resistance persisted. Women continued to pass on medical knowledge through families, and in some places, like parts of Germany and France, female healers remained respected and consulted, especially in rural areas. The conflict between folk medicine and official medicine was far from resolved. Perhaps one of the most vivid images of late medieval medical practice is the so-called plague doctor, the figure in a beaked mask and long cloak associated with the Black Death. While these iconic figures actually became more prominent in the 17th century, their roots lie in this earlier period when city authorities began employing physicians specifically to deal with outbreaks. Their protective gear, based on a mixture of superstition and limited understanding symbolizes both the fear and the evolving attempts at public health control. By the dawn of the 16th century, medicine in Europe stood at a crossroads. The old ways were still deeply embedded in the culture and practice of healing, but new structures, educational, professional, technological, were reshaping the field. The coming centuries would bring revolutions, anatomical discoveries, new scientific methods, and eventually the birth of modern medicine. But to understand how those revolutions could happen, we must see the late Middle Ages not as a dark void, but as a vital bridge, a time when ideas, institutions, and practices laid the groundwork for transformation. So now, at the end of this long journey, let's pause and take a breath. We've walked through dark monastery halls, dusty university chambers, and crowded village streets. We've watched barbers with blades and monks with herbs, scholars with ancient scrolls, and surgeons with trembling hands. We've seen leeches, holy relics, bleeding bowls, and botanical gardens. And through all of it, beneath the rituals, the failures, the half-truths, and hopeful guesses, was a constant, a human need to understand suffering. In many ways, medieval medicine was not medicine as we know it today. It was part science, part religion, part guesswork, part tradition, a strange blend of hope and habit. But that doesn't make it meaningless. In fact, it makes it deeply human. These were people trying to make sense of pain, of disease, of death. Without microscopes, without anesthesia, without germ theory or antibiotics, they still tried. They prayed, they bled, they mixed herbs, they watched the stars, they passed on what they learned. Sometimes they helped, often they didn't, but they kept trying. And over centuries, that persistence began to build something, a vocabulary, a tradition, a memory, a slow layering of insight. Without the trial and error of medieval doctors, there would be no Renaissance anatomists. Without folk remedies and herbalists, there would be no pharmacology. Without those first clumsy dissections and inaccurate textbooks, there would be no modern surgery. The path to knowledge is rarely a straight line. It's a winding trail full of detours and dead ends. Sometimes we go in circles, sometimes we trip. Sometimes we stop in the dark, not knowing which way to turn. But we move forward. Not because we know where we're going, but because we want to know. The history of medicine is a history of asking better questions. And even in the Middle Ages, when the answers were often wrong, the questions still mattered. What causes illness? How can we ease pain? What does the body need? What is health? What is life? These questions have no final answer, but they're worth asking again and again. So as you drift off now, maybe with candlelight still flickering in your mind, imagine a world of quiet rooms and dusty books, of patient healers and uncertain remedies. A world where people faced the unknown every day and still reached out toward understanding. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't always wise, but it was human, and sometimes that's enough.